Case 1. Amanda Stott-Smith. May 23, 2009, Multnomah County Circuit Court, Portland, Oregon. There are moments in the record of a community's history that refuse to be forgotten. Moments that courts document in careful legal language, that investigators revisit long after the proceedings have ended, and that the people who lived through them carry quietly for the rest of their lives. The case of Amanda Stott-Smith is one of those moments. It did not begin on a bridge. It began, as so many of these cases do, in the quiet accumulation of a relationship falling apart, in arguments behind closed doors, in custody schedules that became battlegrounds, and in a mind that, according to those who knew her, had begun to fracture under the pressure of a life she could no longer recognize as her own. Amanda Stott-Smith was a mother of 2 children. Her daughter Trinity was 7 years old. Her son Eldon was 4. By the spring of 2009, Amanda and her estranged husband, Nick Smith, were locked in a custody dispute that court records would later describe as deeply contentious. The marriage had deteriorated, and the legal proceedings surrounding the children had become the central conflict in both of their lives. Those who were close to the family during this period would later tell investigators that Amanda had grown increasingly consumed by the dispute, that she spoke about it constantly, that her anger toward Nick had become something she carried with her everywhere, something that shaped the way she saw every interaction, every legal filing, every exchange. What prosecutors would later establish in Multnomah County Circuit Court is that Amanda Stott-Smith made a decision in the final days of May 2009 that no investigator, no legal professional, and no community member could fully comprehend. She made a decision that was not the product of a single impulsive moment, but of a calculated course of action, one that she had, according to court testimony, considered and planned. The prosecution would argue that what followed was not a breakdown. It was a choice made in the context of revenge. On the evening of May 23, 2009, Amanda Stott-Smith drove to the Selwood Bridge in Portland, Oregon. The Selwood Bridge spans the Willamette River in the southeast section of the city. It is a structure that Portland residents cross without a second thought, a connector between neighborhoods, a part of the city's everyday geography. On that evening, it became the location of one of the most devastating events in Multnomah County's recorded history. Amanda Stott-Smith took her 2 children, Trinity, 7 years old, and Eldon, 4 years old, to the railing of the Selwood Bridge. The bridge stands 75 feet above the Willamette River. Court records establish what happened next with precise, agonizing clarity. She dropped both of her children from the bridge into the river below. The fall was 75 feet. The water was cold. It was evening. Trinity survived. She was pulled from the river by emergency responders who had been contacted after witnesses reported what had happened. She had sustained injuries consistent with the fall, but she was alive. She would require extensive medical treatment and would carry the physical and emotional consequences of that night for the rest of her life. Eldon did not survive. The 4-year-old boy drowned in the Willamette River. He was recovered from the water by emergency responders. He was 4 years old, and he did not come home. The investigation that followed was handled by the Portland Police Bureau and the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. Amanda Stott-Smith did not flee. She was located and taken into custody. In the interviews and proceedings that followed, the question that prosecutors focused on was not whether she had done what witnesses and physical evidence clearly established, it was why. And the answer that emerged through the investigative record was one that the court would ultimately treat not as mitigation, but as motive. The prosecution argued that Amanda Stott-Smith had acted out of a desire to harm her estranged husband by taking from him the children they shared. That the custody dispute had escalated, in her mind, to a point where she had decided that the most devastating thing she could do to Nick Smith was to deprive him of Trinity and Eldon permanently. Prosecutors in Multnomah County Circuit Court built their case on witness testimony, physical evidence, and statements made by Amanda Stott-Smith herself. The legal proceedings moved through the Oregon court system over the following year. In 2010, Amanda Stott-Smith entered a guilty plea to charges of aggravated murder and attempted murder. The plea meant that the full weight of Oregon's most serious criminal statutes was brought to bear on what she had done on that bridge. The sentence handed down by the Multnomah County Circuit Court was life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before any possibility of parole consideration. Amanda Stott-Smith was remanded to the Oregon Department of Corrections and housed at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville, Oregon, the state's primary women's correctional institution. Trinity, the surviving daughter, entered a life shaped by what her mother had done. Child welfare advocates and victim support organizations in Oregon worked with the family in the aftermath, and Trinity's story, the fact that she lived, that she was pulled from the Willamette River and given a future, became a part of the way Portland's legal and social services community talked about this case in the years that followed. Nick Smith, the estranged husband whose custody dispute had formed the backdrop of the prosecution's theory of motive, faced the kind of grief that has no adequate legal or social framework. He had lost his son. His daughter had survived, but would never be the same. And the woman who had done it had been his partner, the mother of his children, someone who had once occupied a central place in a shared life. The case prompted conversations in Oregon's family law and child welfare communities about the warning signs that can precede extreme acts of familial violence, about the point at which a custody dispute crosses from legal conflict into something that requires intervention beyond the courtroom, about the resources available to families in crisis and the gaps in the system that can leave children exposed to danger at the hands of the people who are supposed to protect them. Amanda Stott-Smith remained at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility as the years passed. She was not a figure who generated ongoing news coverage in the way that some high-profile offenders do. The case moved from the headlines into the institutional memory of Multnomah County's legal system, and into the lives of the people most directly affected by it. On June 4, 2023, Amanda Stott-Smith was found dead in her cell at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. The Oregon Department of Corrections confirmed her death. She was 45 years old. The circumstances of her death were reviewed by correctional facility staff and investigators, as a standard procedure in Oregon when an incarcerated person passes away in custody. She had served approximately 13 years of her life sentence. The death of Amanda Stott-Smith did not close the story. It did not restore Eldon to the family that lost him. It did not undo the 75-foot fall, the cold river water, or the night of May 23, 2009. What it closed was a chapter in the institutional record, the legal chapter that had begun with her guilty plea in 2010. Trinity, who would have been in her early 20s at the time of her mother's death in 2023, carried forward a life that began with an act of violence she should never have experienced. Her survival is the part of this story that the Multnomah County legal community and Oregon's child advocacy organizations have pointed to when discussing what accountability and justice look like in the aftermath of a crime this devastating. Not as closure, because closure of this kind does not truly exist, but as evidence that survival is possible, that systems of protection and support, imperfect as they are, can make a difference. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, reachable at 1-800-422-4453, exists for families, caregivers, and individuals who are concerned about the welfare of a child. It is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the years since the Stott-Smith case, child advocates in Oregon have pointed to accessible resources like this as part of the infrastructure that communities need to intervene before a crisis becomes a tragedy. The Selwood Bridge has been rebuilt since 2009. A new structure replaced the old one, opened to traffic in 2016. The river below it still moves south through Portland toward the Columbia. And the legal record of what happened there on the evening of May 23, 2009, remains part of the permanent documentation of what Multnomah County's courts have been asked to reckon with. Justice, in this case, took the form of a life sentence, a guilty plea, and a legal system that held Amanda Stott-Smith fully accountable for what she chose to do. It took the form of emergency responders who pulled a 7-year-old girl from the Willamette River and gave her a future. And it took the form of a community that did not look away, that documented, prosecuted, and remembered. If this case has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support allows this channel to continue telling the stories that matter, told with the seriousness and care that victims and their families deserve. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Case 2, Diane Downs, May 19, 1983, Lane County Circuit Court, Springfield, Oregon. There are cases that define an era of American criminal investigation. Cases that change the way law enforcement approaches witness testimony, physical evidence, and the assumptions that investigators bring to the scene of a crime. The case of Diane Downs is one of those cases. It is a case that unfolded in a small Oregon city, moved through a Lane County courtroom, and ultimately reached into the national consciousness in a way that few Oregon criminal cases ever have. It produced a book. It produced a television film. It produced a methodology, a way of thinking about how a parent can present themselves as a victim while simultaneously being the perpetrator. And it began on a dark rural road in the late spring of 1983. Diane Downs was 27 years old in May of 1983. She lived in Springfield, Oregon, a city in Lane County that sits adjacent to Eugene in the southern Willamette Valley. She had 3 children: Christy, who was 8 years old, Cheryl, who was 7, and Danny, who was 3. By the accounts of those who knew her during this period, Diane Downs was a woman who projected confidence and sociability, someone who talked easily and often, who maintained a composed exterior in circumstances that would unsettle most people, and who had, according to the investigative record compiled by Lane County law enforcement, become deeply involved with a man who had made it clear that he did not want the responsibility of children. The nature of that relationship, and what Diane Downs allegedly understood it to require of her, would become the central element of the prosecution's theory of motive when the case eventually reached Lane County Circuit Court. But on the night of May 19, 1983, what Lane County Sheriff's investigators encountered was something that initially appeared, on its surface, to be a violent attack on a mother and her 3 children by an unknown assailant. At approximately 10:45 in the evening, Diane Downs drove herself and her 3 children to the McKenzie Highway Medical Center in Springfield, Oregon. Her car had been shot multiple times. Cheryl, the 7-year-old, was not breathing and had no detectable pulse. Christy and Danny had both sustained gunshot injuries. Diane Downs herself had a wound to her lower left arm. She was, by multiple accounts from the emergency room staff who received them that night, extraordinarily calm. Calm in a way that the medical personnel who treated the family found immediately and deeply unsettling. Cheryl did not survive. The 7-year-old girl was pronounced dead at McKenzie Highway Medical Center on the night of May 19, 1983. Christy survived, but sustained injuries that left her with lasting physical consequences, including partial paralysis. Danny survived, but also suffered injuries that would affect his long-term health. 3 children had been shot. 1 had not survived. And the only adult account of what had happened that night came from Diane Downs herself. Her account, provided to Lane County Sheriff's Office investigators in the hours and days that followed, described a man she encountered on Old Mohawk Road, a rural stretch in rural Lane County, who had flagged down her vehicle and then, when she did not stop or comply with what he wanted, opened fire on her car. The description she provided was imprecise. The man, she said, had long, dark, bushy hair. She had not seen his face clearly. She did not know who he was. He had appeared from the roadside, attempted to take her keys or her car, and when she did not surrender them, he had fired into the vehicle. Lane County Sheriff's Office investigators began working the case with the assumption that the attack had occurred as described. They searched the area of Old Mohawk Road. They looked for the man Diane Downs described. They found no physical evidence consistent with the presence of an unknown assailant. They found no witnesses. They found nothing on the road that confirmed any part of her account except the undeniable fact that shots had been fired. What investigators did find, as the weeks and months of the investigation accumulated, was a pattern of inconsistency in Diane Downs's behavior, statements, and history. The lead investigator on the case, working with the Lane County District Attorney's Office, began building a picture that pointed not toward an unknown assailant on a rural road, but toward the woman who had driven her children to the hospital that night. The investigation revealed the relationship with a man who had told Diane Downs explicitly that he did not want to be with a woman who had children. It revealed letters and communications that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated that Diane Downs understood what that condition meant for her family. And it revealed, in Christie's eventual testimony, given after months of recovery and under circumstances that investigators and prosecutors carefully navigated to protect the child's welfare, an account of what had actually happened inside that car on Old Mohawk Road. Christie's testimony was among the most significant elements of the prosecution's case in Lane County Circuit Court. A child who had survived, who had recovered enough to communicate, and who ultimately told investigators what she had witnessed was the evidentiary cornerstone that transformed a case built largely on circumstantial evidence into one that a jury could act on. The trial of Diane Downs in Lane County Circuit Court in 1984 became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Oregon's history. The prosecution presented a theory of the case that was as simple as it was devastating. Diane Downs had shot her 3 children on Old Mohawk Road because the man she loved did not want them. She had then driven to the hospital, maintained her composure, constructed a cover story, and presented herself to investigators and emergency personnel as a victim. And Rule, the crime writer who had known Diane Downs personally and had followed the case from its earliest stages, was present throughout the investigation and proceedings. Her account of the case, published as a book that became one of the most widely read true crime works of the 1980s, documented the investigation, the trial, and the profound questions it raised about how the justice system assesses credibility when the accused is a parent and the victims are children. The jury in Lane County Circuit Court deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on charges of murder, attempted murder, and assault. Diane Downs was convicted of the murder of her daughter Cheryl and the attempted murder of Christy and Danny. The sentence handed down was life in prison plus 50 years. Diane Downs entered the Oregon Department of Corrections and has remained incarcerated since her conviction. She has appeared before the Oregon Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision on multiple occasions over the decades since her conviction. On each occasion, the board has declined to grant her release. As of the most recent proceedings on record, Diane Downs remains incarcerated, continuing to serve the sentence handed down by Lane County Circuit Court in 1984. Christy and Danny, the 2 children who survived, grew up outside of their mother's presence. Their lives after the trial, after the testimony, after the recovery from their injuries, after the extraordinary circumstances of their childhood, were followed at a distance by those who had covered the case. They became adults. They built lives. And they carried with them the specific, irreducible weight of what had happened to their family on a rural Oregon road on the night of May 19, 1983. Cheryl, the 7-year-old who did not survive, exists in the record as the victim at the center of the murder conviction. She was 7 years old. She had been shot in her mother's car. She never came home from Old Mohawk Road. The Diane Downs case reshaped how investigators, prosecutors, and the broader legal community approached cases involving parents who present themselves as victims while their children are the ones who have been harmed. It contributed to a body of knowledge, both legal and investigative, about the behavioral and evidentiary markers that distinguish genuine victim accounts from constructed narratives. And it reminded the Oregon legal system and the national audience that followed the case that the most dangerous assumption an investigation can make is the one that begins with the premise that a parent could not have done this. The accountability that Lane County Circuit Court delivered in 1984 was definitive. The jury found Diane Downs guilty. The judge sentenced her to the maximum that Oregon law permitted. The parole board, session after session across 4 decades, has upheld the judgment that she should remain incarcerated. And the record, the court documents, the investigative files, and rules documentation, Christie's testimony, stands as a permanent account of what happened and what the justice system determined should follow. If this story has stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps this channel continue bringing you documented, responsible true crime content. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a case. Case 3, Korena Roberts, June 5, 2009, Washington County Circuit Court, Hillsboro, Oregon. There are cases in the investigative record that require law enforcement professionals to confront aspects of human behavior that fall outside the range of what most people can easily comprehend. Cases that are not simply about violence. Cases where the motivation, the planning, and the execution reveal something so profoundly disturbing that investigators, prosecutors, and jurors find themselves working to maintain the professional distance necessary to see a case through to its legal conclusion. The case of Korena Roberts, investigated by Hillsboro Police and prosecuted in Washington County Circuit Court, is one of those cases. Korena Roberts was 23 years old in the late spring of 2009. She lived in Hillsboro, Oregon, a city in Washington County located west of Portland, part of the Portland metropolitan area. What Washington County investigators and prosecutors would eventually establish is that Korena Roberts had, for a period of time preceding June 5, 2009, been engaged in a deception directed at the people around her, a deception centered on a claimed pregnancy. Roberts had told people in her life, including individuals she interacted with online, that she was pregnant. She was not. And at some point in the weeks before June 5, 2009, the gap between the pregnancy she had claimed and the reality she was living apparently became, in her mind, something that required a resolution. Heather Snively was 21 years old. She was pregnant, genuinely, verifiably pregnant, in the final weeks of her pregnancy, carrying a baby she and those who loved her were preparing to welcome. She had a presence on Craigslist, the online classified platform that in 2009 was one of the primary digital spaces where people bought, sold, and traded goods. She had posted an advertisement related to baby items. Korena Roberts contacted Heather Snively through Craigslist. The communication, reconstructed by investigators from digital records, presented Roberts as a fellow expectant mother interested in trading or acquiring baby clothing and supplies. It was a pretext, a constructed scenario designed to bring Heather Snively to a specific location. That location was Korena Roberts' home in Hillsborough. Heather Snively went to the address. She was 21 years old, in the final weeks of her pregnancy, meeting someone she believed was another expectant mother through a platform she had every reason to believe was a routine channel for this kind of transaction. She had no reason to anticipate what Washington County investigators would later determine had been carefully planned before she arrived. What happened inside Korena Roberts' home on June 5, 2009, was established through the physical evidence collected by Hillsborough police and the forensic investigation conducted by Washington County law enforcement in the hours and days that followed. Heather Snively was subjected to a fatal attack inside Roberts' residence. The medical examiner's findings and the evidence documented at the scene established the nature and severity of what occurred. Roberts then used a blade to attempt to remove the unborn child from Heather Snively's body. The infant did not survive. Heather Snively's body was concealed inside Roberts' crawlspace. The discovery came through the investigative work of Hillsborough police. In the period following June 5, Heather Snively had been reported missing. She had gone to an address and had not returned. The Craigslist communication trail provided investigators with the connection they needed. Law enforcement made contact with Korena Roberts. The investigation of her residence led to the discovery of Heather Snively's remains concealed in the crawlspace beneath the home. The case that Washington County prosecutors built in the months that followed was one of premeditated first-degree murder. The evidence established not only what Roberts had done but the planning and deception that had preceded it, the false pregnancy claim, the constructed Craigslist contact, the luring of Heather Snively to a location Roberts controlled. The prosecution presented a case to Washington County Circuit Court that documented each element of what investigators had uncovered. In October of 2010, Korena Roberts appeared in Washington County Circuit Court and entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The plea was entered in the context of an agreement that removed the death penalty from consideration. The sentence handed down by Washington County Circuit Court was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Korena Roberts was remanded to the Oregon Department of Corrections. She will not be released. The Snively family, Heather's parents, her siblings, the people who had been awaiting the birth of her child, faced a grief that was layered in a way that defies simple description. They had lost Heather. They had lost the child she was carrying. They had lost them both to a crime that had targeted Heather's pregnancy specifically, that had used her openness and her anticipation as the mechanism of her death. The Washington County victim advocacy community worked with the family in the aftermath, and Heather Snively's name has been cited in Oregon legislative and policy discussions about online safety, digital transaction security, and the protocols that should govern meetings arranged through platforms like Craigslist. The Roberts case accelerated conversations that were already beginning in 2009 about the safety of in-person meetings arranged through online classified platforms. Law enforcement agencies across Oregon and nationally began developing and disseminating guidance about precautions to take when meeting strangers from online platforms, guidance that, in the years since, has become standard public safety communication. Korena Roberts remained in the Oregon Department of Corrections, serving her life without parole sentence. The permanence of that sentence reflects the Washington County Court's assessment of what she had done, a crime of planning, deception, and violence against a young woman and the child she was carrying. Heather Snively was 21 years old. She was days or weeks away from becoming a mother. She had responded to what appeared to be a completely ordinary online interaction. Her death, and the death of her unborn child, represent a loss that Washington County's legal proceedings addressed with the full weight of Oregon's criminal statutes. The accountability delivered by Washington County Circuit Court in 2010, a life sentence with no possibility of parole, was the legal system's definitive response to what Korena Roberts had done. It was a sentence designed to reflect the permanent nature of the harm she had caused. And in the record of Washington County's courts, the case stands as one of the most meticulously documented prosecutions in the county's history. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you believe that stories like Heather Snively's deserve to be told with care and precision. Your subscription keeps this channel going. Hit subscribe and the bell notification so you're notified every time a new episode goes live. Case 4, Jessica Dutro, August 2012, Washington County Circuit Court, Tigard, Oregon. There are cases in the documented record of Oregon's courts that demonstrate, with terrible clarity, how the people who are supposed to be a child's first and most permanent line of protection can instead become the source of the greatest danger a child faces. The case of Jessica Dutro, prosecuted in Washington County Circuit Court following events that occurred in Tigard, Oregon, in the summer of 2012, is a case of this kind. It is a case about a 4-year-old boy named Zachary. It is a case about what the court record established he endured. And it is a case about the accountability that Washington County's legal system was ultimately able to deliver on his behalf. Zachary Dutro was 4 years old in the summer of 2012. He was living at a homeless shelter in Tigard, Oregon, with his mother, Jessica Dutro, and her boyfriend, Brian Kennedy. What Washington County investigators and prosecutors would establish through the course of the investigation and the subsequent trial is a documented record of what Zachary experienced in that environment over a period of weeks, a record assembled from physical evidence, medical findings, and a set of digital communications that became among the most damning pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. Jessica Dutro had exchanged messages on Facebook with Brian Kennedy in the period preceding Zachary's death. Those messages, recovered by investigators and introduced into evidence in Washington County Circuit Court, contained explicit statements about Zachary. The messages revealed that Jessica Dutro had expressed beliefs about her son, about characteristics she attributed to him, and had directed Kennedy to subject the 4-year-old to physical harm on the basis of those beliefs. The content of those messages, as documented in the Washington County Court record, established that what Zachary experienced was not a single act, but a sustained pattern directed by his mother. Zachary sustained injuries over a period that investigators determined was not a brief episode, but an extended ordeal. The medical findings presented to Washington County Circuit Court documented the nature and severity of those injuries. He had been subjected to repeated physical harm. The injuries were consistent with what investigators characterized as prolonged abuse. In August of 2012, Zachary Dutro became unresponsive. He required emergency medical attention. Jessica Dutro did not immediately seek that attention. The delay in getting Zachary to emergency medical care, a delay that prosecutors argued was intentional, was a significant element of the case. Washington County prosecutors established that Dutro had not acted with the urgency that Zachary's condition required, and that this delay had consequences for any chance he might have had of survival. Zachary Dutro did not survive. He was 4 years old. The medical findings presented at trial documented what he had endured, and the cause of his death was established as severe abdominal injuries consistent with the harm he had been subjected to over the preceding period. The investigation was conducted by Tigard Police and Washington County law enforcement working in conjunction with the Oregon Department of Human Services and Child Welfare investigators. The Facebook messages recovered from Dutro's and Kennedy's accounts provided investigators with direct, explicit evidence of premeditation and intent that would prove central to the prosecution's case. Both Jessica Dutro and Brian Kennedy faced criminal charges in Washington County. Kennedy entered a plea and was sentenced for his role in what had happened to Zachary. Jessica Dutro went to trial in Washington County Circuit Court. The case presented to the jury in April of 2014 included the medical evidence, the testimony of investigators and medical professionals, and the Facebook messages that documented what Dutro had directed. The Washington County jury returned a verdict of guilty. Jessica Dutro was convicted of murder, murder by abuse, and assault. The sentence handed down by Washington County Circuit Court was life in prison. She was remanded to the Oregon Department of Corrections. The Facebook messages that became central to the prosecution's case also became, in the broader conversation about child welfare and digital evidence in Oregon, an example of how digital communications can preserve the kind of explicit evidence of intent that is rarely available to prosecutors in cases of child abuse. Oregon's child welfare community cited the Dutro case in subsequent years in discussions about the evidentiary value of social media records in investigations of domestic violence and child abuse, and about what those records can reveal about the planning and direction that can precede acts of harm against children. Zachary Dutro Bogus was 4 years old. He was in the care of the people who were legally and morally responsible for his protection. He did not receive that protection. What he received instead was documented by investigators, established by prosecutors, and judged by a Washington County jury. The verdict of guilty and the sentence of life in prison represent the legal system's accounting for what was done to him. The Oregon child welfare system's response to the Dutro case also included, in the aftermath, a review of the circumstances that had placed Zachary in an environment where he was at risk, of the interactions between the family and social services, of the warning signs that existed and the points at which intervention might have been possible. Those reviews, and the policy discussions they generated within Oregon's Department of Human Services and Child Advocacy community, were a part of the institutional response to Zachary's death, an effort to understand what systemic changes might reduce the likelihood that another child would experience what he had experienced. The accountability delivered by Washington County Circuit Court in April of 2014 was the most that the legal system could offer Zachary Dutro Bogus. It could not restore him. It could not undo what he had endured. What it could do, and did, was hold Jessica Dutro fully accountable under Oregon's criminal statutes and deliver a sentence that reflected the court's judgment about the gravity of what she had done to her son. If this case has affected you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. This channel exists to tell these stories with the seriousness and care that the victims deserve. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Case 5, Ashley Palmer, May 3, 2022, Multnomah County, Gresham, Oregon. There are cases that the legal system is never asked to adjudicate, cases where the circumstances preclude prosecution, where the perpetrator does not survive to face charges, and where the only formal proceedings are the investigative ones conducted by law enforcement in the immediate aftermath. The case of Ashley Palmer, documented by Gresham Police and Multnomah County law enforcement following events that occurred on May 3, 2022, is a case of this kind. There was no trial. There was no verdict. There was no sentencing hearing. What there was, and what the investigative record provides, is a documented account of what officers discovered during a welfare check at a residential apartment in Gresham, Oregon, and a set of circumstances that Multnomah County investigators carefully reconstructed in the weeks and months that followed. Ashley Palmer was a mother of 2 children. Her son was 8 years old. Her daughter was 6 years old. By the spring of 2022, the record of her personal and legal circumstances indicates that she was involved in a custody dispute with the father of her children, a dispute that, according to accounts gathered by investigators from people who knew the family, had grown increasingly contentious in the months preceding May of 2022. The custody proceedings had created a dynamic that those close to the situation described as deeply strained, and the tension surrounding the dispute had intensified in the period immediately before the events of May 3. On May 3, 2022, a welfare check was requested at the apartment where Ashley Palmer and her children were residing in Gresham. The circumstances that prompted that welfare check, the specific communication or concern that led someone to contact law enforcement, are part of the documented investigative record. When Gresham police officers arrived at the apartment and made entry, what they discovered brought the investigation that followed into motion immediately. The officers found Ashley Palmer's 2 children, her 8-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter, and they found Ashley Palmer herself. Both children had sustained fatal gunshot injuries. Ashley Palmer had also sustained a fatal gunshot injury. The scene that investigators documented was one from which no one in the apartment had survived. The Gresham police investigation, conducted in coordination with Multnomah County law enforcement, examined the physical evidence at the scene, the sequence of events that the evidence suggested had occurred, and the circumstances of Ashley Palmer's life in the period leading up to May 3rd. The investigative conclusion reached by law enforcement was that Ashley Palmer had shot and fatally wounded her 2 children and had then turned the firearm on herself. The investigation was classified as a murder-suicide. Because the perpetrator did not survive, there were no criminal proceedings. No charges were filed. No indictment was issued. No trial was held. The legal machinery of Multnomah County's court system, which would have been activated had Ashley Palmer survived, was never engaged. What the case produced was an investigative record, a medical examiner's report, and the kind of grief that settles over a community when something of this magnitude occurs without the structure of a criminal proceeding to contain it. The father of the children, the man who had been involved in the custody dispute with Ashley Palmer, lost both of his children on May 3, 2022. He had been engaged in a legal process designed to determine how those children's lives would be structured, how time with each parent would be divided, what the framework of their upbringing would look like. That process ended on May 3rd in a way that no court, no family law proceeding, and no custody schedule was ever designed to address. The investigative response to the Palmer case in Multnomah County prompted, as such events often do in law enforcement and mental health communities, a review of the circumstances that had preceded it. Custody disputes are among the most psychologically pressurized legal proceedings that family courts handle, and the research literature on the relationship between extreme domestic stress and violence against children has grown substantially in the decades since family court systems began documenting these cases systematically. Gresham's law enforcement community and Multnomah County's broader social services infrastructure were part of a regional response to the Palmer case that included both the specific investigative process and the broader institutional reflection on the warning signs that can precede events of this kind. The children, an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl, had no part in the legal and personal conflict that surrounded their family. They were children. They went to school, they had friends, they had birthdays and favorite things, and the ordinary texture of childhood that every child deserves to carry forward into an adulthood they get to choose. That adulthood was taken from them on May 3, 2022, in Gresham, Oregon. The case of Ashley Palmer sits in the historical record of Multnomah County not as a prosecuted case, but as a documented tragedy, one that is part of the broader conversation about child welfare, family court support systems, mental health intervention in custody disputes, and the resources that communities need to identify and respond to families in crisis before the crisis reaches a point of no return. Oregon's family court support services, mental health crisis resources, and domestic violence advocacy organizations all cite cases like this one when making the case for expanded intervention capacity, for the kinds of early-stage support and mental health services that can reach families before the pressures of a custody dispute or a relationship breakdown create circumstances that courts, investigators, and communities are left to document and grieve. For anyone who is aware of a child or a family in crisis, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453, is available at any hour. Oregon's own child welfare and family crisis resources are accessible through the Oregon Department of Human Services. These systems exist precisely because the alternative, a community that discovers, after the fact, what it might have been able to prevent, is one that leaves an irreplaceable loss in its wake. The 2 children at the center of the Palmer case deserved a future. They deserved to grow up, to navigate the complexities of a family restructured by divorce or separation, to carry forward whatever resilience and joy they had already begun building in their 8 and 6 years of life. Their names are in the record. Their loss is in the record. And the obligation that their loss creates, to take seriously the warning signs, to reach families in crisis, to invest in the infrastructure of intervention, is something that communities across Oregon and nationally continue to grapple with. If this story has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It is because of your support that this channel can continue telling these stories with the respect and depth that they deserve. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you are always informed when a new episode is published. Case 6. Jillian McCabe, November 3, 2014, Lincoln County Circuit Court, Newport, Oregon. There are cases where the legal system is asked to grapple with the intersection of criminal accountability and severe mental illness. Cases where what happened is not in dispute, but where the question of how a court, a jury, and a community should understand what happened is genuinely, agonizingly complicated. The case of Jillian McCabe, prosecuted in Lincoln County Circuit Court following events that occurred in Newport, Oregon, on November 3, 2014, is a case of this kind. It is a case in which mental illness was not a defense constructed for the purposes of litigation, but a documented, medically established reality that Lincoln County's legal proceedings had to weigh against the fact that a 6-year-old child had lost his life. London McCabe was 6 years old. He had autism. He was the son of Jillian McCabe and her husband, Jason McCabe, and by the accounts of those who knew the family, his care was extraordinarily demanding. Jason McCabe had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative neurological condition that had, by 2014, significantly reduced his capacity to participate in London's care. The weight of managing London's needs had fallen in large part on Jillian McCabe, and the record of her mental and emotional state in the period leading up to November 3, 2014, as assembled by investigators and the mental health professionals who later evaluated her, indicates that she had been under a level of stress and psychological strain that had moved far beyond what she could manage. Those who knew Jillian McCabe in the months before November 3 described a woman who appeared to be in serious distress. There were accounts of statements she had made, statements that, in retrospect, those who heard them recognized as signals of a deteriorating mental state. But the nature of caregiver stress, and the particular isolation that can accompany the full-time care of a child with significant special needs in a household where the other parent is also managing a serious illness, is such that the line between normal caregiver exhaustion and acute mental health crisis is not always visible to the people around it until it has already been crossed. On the morning of November 3, 2014, Jillian McCabe drove with London to the Yaquina Bay Bridge in Newport, Oregon. The Yaquina Bay Bridge is a landmark of the Oregon coast, a long, arching concrete structure that spans the bay at Newport. It stands 133 feet above the water at its highest point. Jillian McCabe carried her 6-year-old son to the center of the bridge, and then she dropped him into the water below. London McCabe's body was recovered from Yaquina Bay later that day. He was 6 years old. The fall from 133 feet was not survivable. Jillian McCabe did not flee. In a detail that Lincoln County investigators found significant, and that would be addressed in the legal proceedings that followed, she called emergency services herself after reaching the end of the bridge, reporting what she had done before anyone else knew it had happened. This act of self-reporting was consistent with the mental health evaluations that would follow. The assessment of investigators and mental health professionals was not that Jillian McCabe had acted with the premeditated calculation of someone who intended to escape accountability, but that she had acted in the context of a severe psychiatric crisis, one that had been building for a long time and had reached a catastrophic conclusion on the Yaquina Bay Bridge. Lincoln County law enforcement conducted the investigation. The physical evidence was clear. Jillian McCabe had carried her son to the bridge and dropped him into the water. There was no ambiguity about what had occurred, and she did not dispute it. The legal and psychiatric evaluations that followed in the months between November 2014 and the eventual court proceedings were focused not on the factual question of what had happened, but on the far more difficult question of how Lincoln County Circuit Court should respond to a crime committed by someone whose mental illness was severe, documented, and medically verified. In February of 2016, Jillian McCabe appeared in Lincoln County Circuit Court and entered a guilty plea to murder. The plea was entered with acknowledgement of her mental illness, an acknowledgement by both the defense and the prosecution that what had happened on the Yaquina Bay Bridge had occurred in the context of a documented psychiatric crisis. The court was asked to weigh the full complexity of that reality against the legal obligation to deliver accountability for the death of a 6-year-old child. The sentence handed down by Lincoln County Circuit Court was life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before any possibility of parole consideration. Jillian McCabe was remanded to the Oregon Department of Corrections. The response to the McCabe case in Oregon's disability advocacy and caregiver support communities was significant and lasting. London McCabe had been a child with autism, a fact that brought the case directly into conversations already underway in Oregon about the resources available to families caring for children with significant special needs, and about what happens when those resources are inadequate to the demands being placed on caregivers. The Oregon Council on Autism Spectrum Disorder and various disability advocacy organizations in the state used the tragedy of London's death to amplify ongoing calls for expanded caregiver support services, respite care access, and mental health resources specifically targeted at parents and caregivers of children with developmental disabilities. Jason McCabe, London's father, was left to grieve the loss of his son in circumstances of profound complexity. His own illness, the actions of his wife, the legal proceedings that followed, and the public attention that had turned his family's private tragedy into a matter of widespread public discussion. London McCabe was 6 years old. He had autism, which meant that his life required more support, more patience, and more specialized care than many children need. He deserved to receive that care. He deserved to grow up. He deserved the future that his disability, properly supported, would not have precluded. His death on the Yaquina Bay Bridge on November 3, 2014, prompted conversations in Oregon's legal, medical, and advocacy communities about what systems of support should have been in place and what must be built to ensure that no other family reaches the breaking point that the McCabe family reached. The Lincoln County Circuit Court sentence, life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years, reflected both the gravity of what had happened to London and the court's assessment of the role that Jillian McCabe's documented mental illness had played in the events of November 3. It was a sentence that attempted to balance accountability with an honest reckoning with the psychiatric realities the court had been asked to weigh. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support means that stories like London McCabe's are told with the seriousness and care they deserve. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you are always the first to hear our next episode. Case 7. Rebekah Gasperino. April 2022. Lynn County Circuit Court, Albany, Oregon. There are cases that move through the legal system slowly. Cases where the question of what the court can do is complicated not by ambiguity about the facts, but by the mental and legal competency of the person the system is attempting to hold accountable. The case of Rebekah Gasperino, investigated by Albany police and processed through Lynn County Circuit Court following events that occurred in Albany, Oregon, in April of 2022, is a case of this kind. It is a case that has not yet produced the kind of permanent legal resolution that courts and communities typically seek when a child has lost their life, and the reasons for that absence of resolution are themselves a part of the story, a part of the ongoing conversation about what justice looks like when the legal system encounters the limits of its own capacity to hold a mentally incapacitated individual accountable. Sophia Gasperino was 3 years old. She was Rebekah Gasperino's daughter. She lived in Albany, Oregon, in Lynn County, in a residential setting where she was in the care of her mother. She was 3 years old. In the early hours of what Lynn County investigators determined was an April morning in 2022, Albany police conducted a routine traffic stop. The stop involved Rebekah Gasperino. The officers who made the stop documented that her behavior during the encounter was erratic, that she presented in a manner that was significantly outside the range of normal, that something about her demeanor and responses prompted immediate concern. The officers who conducted the stop made the judgment, based on what they observed, that a welfare check at Gasperino's residence was warranted. When law enforcement arrived at the residence and made entry, they found Sophia. The 3-year-old girl had been fatally harmed in her crib. The investigation that followed, conducted by Albany police and Lynn County law enforcement, established the circumstances of Sophia's death and identified Rebekah Gasperino as the person responsible for what had happened. Rebekah Gasperino was taken into custody. Lynn County prosecutors brought charges of aggravated murder, Oregon's most serious homicide charge, carrying the potential for a sentence of life without parole or, in some circumstances, the death penalty. The legal proceedings in Lynn County Circuit Court began with what appeared to be a path toward a trial that would adjudicate what had happened to Sophia Gasperino and hold her mother accountable under Oregon's criminal statutes. But the path that the Lynn County Circuit Court proceedings took was not a straight one toward trial and verdict. As the case moved through the legal system, court-ordered psychological evaluations were conducted on Rebekah Gasperino. The mental health professionals who assessed her produced findings that Lynn County Circuit Court was required to grapple with, findings that documented a level of psychological incapacity that had significant implications for the court's ability to proceed. Under Oregon law and the constitutional framework that governs criminal proceedings throughout the United States, a defendant must be competent to stand trial, must have the capacity to understand the proceedings against them and to assist their own attorney in mounting a defense. The evaluations conducted on Rebekah Gasperino determined that she did not meet this standard. She was found, through court-ordered assessment, to be mentally unfit to aid in her own defense. The determination was not that she had been mentally ill at the time of the crime, a different legal standard, but that her current mental state precluded her participation in the legal proceedings being conducted against her. Lynn County Circuit Court, operating within the constraints that Oregon law imposes in these circumstances, ordered that Rebekah Gasperino be civilly committed to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem. The Oregon State Hospital is the state's primary forensic psychiatric facility, the institution that Oregon's courts use when defendants are found incompetent to proceed with criminal trials. Civil commitment in this context means that Rebekah Gasperino was placed in a secure psychiatric treatment setting, with the theoretical possibility that if her mental state improved to the point where she could be deemed competent, the criminal proceedings could resume. In May of 2026, a Lynn County Circuit Court judge officially dismissed the aggravated murder charges against Rebekah Gasperino without prejudice. The dismissal without prejudice means that the charges could theoretically be refiled if her competency were ever restored. But the psychological evaluations on which the court relied had characterized her mental incapacity as permanent, a determination that makes the prospect of reinstated charges and a future trial extremely uncertain. The result, as of May 2026, is that Rebekah Gasperino remains civilly committed to the Oregon State Hospital. She has not been convicted of any crime in connection with Sophia's death. She has not been acquitted. The Lynn County Circuit Court's dismissal of charges represents the legal system's acknowledgement that it has reached the limit of what it can do in the specific circumstances this case has presented. For the people who loved Sophia Gasperino, for her family, for those who knew her, for the Albany community that became aware of her story through the media coverage of the case, the outcome that the Lynn County Circuit Court has arrived at is a deeply difficult one to process. A 3-year-old girl lost her life. The person the court determined was responsible for her death has not been convicted, has not been sentenced, and has been placed in a psychiatric institution rather than a correctional one. The legal system has arrived at this outcome through the application of rules and standards that exist for important constitutional and humanitarian reasons, but the outcome itself is one that leaves a profound sense of unresolved grief and institutional inadequacy in its wake. The Gasperino case is part of a broader ongoing conversation in Oregon and nationally about the intersection of severe mental illness and the criminal justice system, about the limits of criminal prosecution as a mechanism for accountability when the person the system seeks to hold accountable does not have the mental capacity to participate in that process. Oregon's courts, the Oregon State Hospital, and the state's mental health and legal advocacy communities continue to wrestle with the questions this case raises. Questions about what justice means in these circumstances, what community safety requires, and how the legal system should respond when its standard tools for accountability cannot be effectively deployed. Sophia was 3 years old. She deserved protection. She deserved to grow up. The legal record of what happened in Lynn County Circuit Court is the documentation of a system that tried to deliver accountability and encountered the limits of what it could do. It is an honest record, and it is a painful one. If this story has affected you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement with this channel helps ensure that cases like Sophia's continue to be told and remembered. Subscribe and hit the bell. Case 8, Sarah Safranek, February 17th, 2021, Ogle County Circuit Court, Oregon, Illinois. There are moments in the documentation of any true crime series where the audience must be reminded that the geographic record of these cases does not always align neatly with the thematic focus of a documentary. The case of Sarah Safranek is one of those moments. This case took place not in the state of Oregon, but in the village of Oregon in Ogle County, Illinois, a small community in the northern part of the state, far removed in both geography and legal jurisdiction from the Pacific Northwest cases that form the bulk of this documentary's record. It is a case that has been included here because the facts that investigators established and the legal proceedings that followed in Ogle County reflect a pattern that this documentary has documented in multiple contexts: a parent, a child, a home, and a death that the legal system spent years attempting to address through the mechanisms of criminal prosecution. Nathaniel Burton was 7 years old. He lived in the village of Oregon, Illinois, with his mother, Sarah Safranek. On February 17, 2021, emergency services received a call reporting a child who was not breathing at a residential address in the community. First responders arrived at the location and found Nathaniel. He was transported to a medical facility and was pronounced dead. The investigation into Nathaniel Burton's death was conducted by Ogle County law enforcement working with Illinois State Police and the Office of the Ogle County State's Attorney. The findings of the investigation and the forensic and medical evidence assembled in the weeks and months that followed formed the basis for criminal charges against Sarah Safranek. Investigators determined that Nathaniel's death had not been the result of a natural medical event or an accident. The evidence pointed to his mother. Sarah Safranek was charged with first-degree murder in Ogle County. The legal proceedings that followed were prolonged and complex, a reflection of the kind of contested legal process that can develop when a defendant moves through multiple phases of plea negotiation, withdrawal of plea, and eventual resolution. Safranek initially entered a plea in the case that she subsequently withdrew, extending the period of legal uncertainty and delaying the resolution that the case required. The case moved through Ogle County's legal system over a period of years. The investigation remained active. The prosecution continued to press the case. On November 12, 2025, Sarah Safranek returned to Ogle County Court. She entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The plea was not the product of a negotiated reduction in charges. It was a plea to the charges filed, to first-degree murder in connection with the death of her son Nathaniel. The sentence handed down by the Ogle County Court was 35 years in prison. The sentence was structured to be served at 100%, meaning that Sarah Safranek is not eligible for early release or the kind of percentage-based reduction that applies to many prison sentences under Illinois law. She will serve the full 35 years. Nathaniel Burton was 7 years old. He was a child in the first years of his education, a child for whom the ordinary arc of growing up, of school and friendships and the accumulation of experiences that form a person, had barely begun. The legal proceedings in Ogle County Circuit Court that concluded in November of 2025 represented the formal accounting for what had been done to him. A first-degree murder conviction, a 35-year sentence at 100%, and a permanent entry in the criminal record of Ogle County that documents what Sarah Safranek was convicted of doing. For the family and community that lost Nathaniel, and for the broader audience of this documentary that has now followed the records of multiple cases involving children who did not receive the protection they deserved, the outcome in Ogle County provides a measure of legal accountability. It does not restore Nathaniel. It does not undo February 17, 2021. But it is the legal system's formal, documented response to his death, and it carries the permanence of a conviction and a sentence that ensures accountability is on the record. The Safranek case, like the others documented in this series, is also part of the broader institutional conversation about the systems, child welfare, domestic violence intervention, mental health support, and community awareness that must function effectively if children in homes across the country are to receive the protection they are owed. Every case in this documentary represents both an individual tragedy and a systemic question. What more could have been done? What resources were or were not in place? And what must communities build to reduce the likelihood that another child will face what Nathaniel Burton faced? Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case documented on this channel represents a story that deserves to be told and a victim who deserves to be remembered. Subscribe, leave a comment, and ring the bell to stay connected to this community. Case 9, Jessica Marie Andersch, June 7, 2025, Deschutes County Circuit Court, Redmond, Oregon. There are cases that move through the legal system in a way that is unusual. Cases where the evidentiary record assembled by investigators is substantially supplemented by the defendant's own statements, made in legal proceedings, on the record, despite the explicit warnings of a presiding judge. The case of Jessica Marie Andersch, investigated by Redmond police and being processed through Deschutes County Circuit Court following events that occurred on June 7, 2025, is a case of this kind. It is a case that is ongoing. As of the date of this documentary's production, Andersch has not yet entered a formal plea and has not been tried, and it is a case in which the public record has been shaped in significant part by the defendant's own conduct in open court. Tracy Lynn Berry was 56 years old. She was the mother of Jessica Marie Andersch. She lived with her daughter in a shared duplex in Redmond, Oregon, a city in Deschutes County in Central Oregon, east of the Cascade Mountain Range, a community of approximately 35,000 people. On June 7, 2025, Jessica Marie Andersch contacted emergency services and reported that she had killed her mother. Officers from the Redmond Police Department responded to the duplex and found the body of Tracy Lynn Berry. The evidence documented at the scene was consistent with a fatal stabbing. Andersch was taken into custody. Deschutes County prosecutors filed criminal charges reflecting the circumstances of what investigators had documented. The case entered the Deschutes County Circuit Court system, and the legal proceedings that followed took a course that, in certain specific respects, was unlike the typical progression of a criminal case. In August of 2025, Jessica Marie Andersch appeared before a Deschutes County Circuit Court judge via video link, a common format for hearings during periods of pretrial custody. During the hearing, the judge issued explicit warnings to Andersch about the right to remain silent and the potential consequences of making statements in open court. Andersch ignored those warnings. She spoke twice, on the record, on camera, in a hearing conducted in Deschutes County Circuit Court, and stated explicitly that she had stabbed her mother and that she wished to be sent to prison. These statements, made in open court, on the record, captured in the official proceedings of Deschutes County Circuit Court, became part of the evidentiary and legal record of the case in a way that is unusual in criminal proceedings. Defendants are advised, consistently and emphatically, not to make incriminating statements in court hearings. The presence of a judge, the existence of a court record, and the explicit warnings that were issued to Andersch before she spoke did not prevent her from making statements that amounted to a direct confession in a public legal proceeding. Following those statements, the court ordered a formal evaluation of Jessica Marie Andersch's mental fitness to stand trial. The evaluation was conducted by mental health professionals designated by the court, and the findings were presented back to Deschutes County Circuit Court in December of 2025. The court, on the basis of those findings, ruled that Andersch was competent to stand trial, that she met the legal standard of having the capacity to understand the proceedings against her and to assist her attorney in her defense. With the competency determination in place, the court set January 14, 2026, as the date for Andersch's formal plea entry. The case, as of the date of this documentary's production, was continuing to move through the Deschutes County Circuit Court system toward the trial and resolution that the charge requires. Tracy Lynn Berry was 56 years old. She shared a home with her daughter in Redmond. She had, by the accounts available in the public record, been a presence in her daughter's life up to the moment of her death on June 7, 2025. The nature of the relationship between Tracy and Jessica, the circumstances that preceded the events of that evening, and the fuller context of what brought the family to the situation that police encountered when they responded to Andersch's own call. These are questions that the Deschutes County Circuit Court proceedings will address as the case moves forward. The Andersch case is notable for the documentary record, for the fact that the defendant's own statements in open court have become a significant part of the legal file that Deschutes County prosecutors are working with. It is also notable for what the mental competency evaluation process revealed, that the court, despite the unusual nature of Andersch's behavior in the August hearing, found her to be legally competent to proceed. That determination is itself a part of the case's ongoing significance. a signal that the proceedings will move forward and that Deschutes County Circuit Court will be asked to deliver a formal adjudication of what the evidence and the record establish about the death of Tracy Lynn Berry. The outcome of the Andersch case will be documented in Deschutes County Circuit Court's official records when it reaches its conclusion. The victim at its center, Tracy Lynn Berry, 56 years old, a mother who shared her home with her daughter, deserves the full accounting that a completed legal proceeding provides. If you are following the Andersch case, subscribe to Cold Case Hour for continued coverage of Oregon true crime proceedings. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell so you are always informed when we publish new episodes and case updates. Case 10. Amy Marie Robertson, January 13, 2017, Marion County Circuit Court, Kaiser, Oregon. There are cases that demonstrate the cyclical and deeply uncertain nature of the intersection between severe mental illness and criminal accountability. Cases where the legal process does not produce a linear path from crime to conviction, but instead moves through multiple phases of charge, dismissal, commitment, and eventual return to the criminal court system, reflecting the genuinely complex reality that courts face when the person they are attempting to hold accountable has a mental health history that cannot be set aside. The case of Amy Marie Robertson, which originated with events in Kaiser, Oregon, in January of 2017, and which has moved through the Marion County Circuit Court system across more than 8 years, is a case of this kind. Caden Berry was 12 years old. He was Amy Marie Robertson's son. He lived with his mother in an apartment in Kaiser, Oregon, a city in Marion County located immediately north of Salem, the state capital. On January 13, 2017, a neighbor at the apartment complex where the family lived contacted emergency services after encountering Amy Marie Robertson in the courtyard of the building. Robertson was in a state of acute psychological distress. She was screaming, her behavior was severely disorganized, and the content of what she was expressing, including references to demonic forces, indicated to the neighbor and to the emergency responders who arrived that she was experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. When law enforcement and emergency medical personnel made entry into the apartment, they found Caden Berry. The 12-year-old boy was dead. The investigation conducted by Kaiser Police and Marion County law enforcement in the immediate aftermath established that Caden had been strangled inside the apartment. His mother was the only adult present. The investigation identified Amy Marie Robertson as the person responsible for Caden's death. Robertson was taken into custody. Marion County prosecutors filed charges appropriate to the circumstances. A mother had strangled her 12-year-old son, and the court was asked to hold her accountable for that act under Oregon's criminal statutes. The case entered the Marion County Circuit Court system, and the legal proceedings that followed took a course determined not primarily by the factual record, which was not seriously disputed, but by the mental health evaluations that the court was required to consider. The evaluations of Amy Marie Robertson's mental state, conducted by court-ordered mental health professionals in the period following her arrest, produced findings that Marion County Circuit Court was required to weigh under Oregon's legal framework for criminal competency and mental health defenses. Robertson had been in the grip of a severe psychiatric episode at the time of the crime. The neighbor's account, the statements made to first responders, and the content of her behavior in the immediate aftermath all pointed to a mental state that was profoundly impaired. The evaluations conducted in the context of the criminal proceedings found that she was not competent to stand trial, that her mental illness was severe enough to preclude her participation in the legal proceedings against her in a way that met constitutional standards. Marion County Circuit Court, operating under the constraints that Oregon law imposes in these circumstances, dismissed the charges against Amy Marie Robertson without prejudice in May of 2020. The dismissal without prejudice preserved the legal possibility of refiling if her competency were restored. Robertson was civilly committed to the Oregon State Hospital, the same institution that serves as Oregon's primary forensic psychiatric facility for defendants found incompetent to stand trial. For more than 4 years, Amy Marie Robertson was held at the Oregon State Hospital as a civilly committed patient. The Oregon State Hospital provided the psychiatric treatment and secure institutional environment that her mental health condition required. The criminal case against her was formally in abeyance, dismissed without prejudice, with the theoretical possibility of reactivation if competency were restored. On December 12, 2024, Marion County prosecutors made a decision that brought the Robertson case back into the active criminal court system. Prosecutors officially refiled first-degree murder charges against Amy Marie Robertson. The refiling represented a determination by the Marion County District Attorney's Office that the legal and psychiatric circumstances had changed in a way that made renewed prosecution appropriate, that the barriers that had previously precluded criminal proceedings had been addressed sufficiently to justify bringing the case back before the court. As of the production of this documentary, the refiled charges against Amy Marie Robertson represent the current status of the case. Marion County Circuit Court will be required to assess her competency in the context of the refiled proceedings to determine whether the legal and psychiatric standards for criminal trial have been met, and to move toward the kind of formal adjudication that the death of Caden Berry, which occurred more than 8 years before the refiling, has yet to receive. Caden Berry was 12 years old. He was in his early adolescence, the age at which children are beginning to form the identities they will carry into adulthood, building friendships and interests, developing the individual character that distinguishes them from who they were as younger children and forecasts who they will become as adults. He lost his life on January 13, 2017, in an apartment in Kaiser, Oregon. The circumstances of his death and the documented mental health history of his mother created a legal situation that Marion County's courts have been processing, in one form or another, for the better part of a decade. The refiling of first-degree murder charges in December of 2024 is a signal that Marion County's legal system has not abandoned the effort to deliver a formal criminal accounting for what happened to Caden. It is a signal that the system continues to seek the kind of resolution, a trial, a verdict, a sentence, that the death of a 12-year-old child requires and deserves. Oregon's legal framework for cases involving defendants with severe mental illness is one that attempts to balance competing obligations, the constitutional protections that prohibit the criminal prosecution of a person who cannot meaningfully participate in their own defense, and the accountability obligations that arise from the fact that a child has lost their life and a family has been permanently harmed. The Robertson case sits at the intersection of those competing obligations, and its resolution, whenever it comes, will be a document of how Marion County Circuit Court navigated that intersection. For the family of Caden Berry, for the people who knew him, who were part of his 12 years of life, who have waited for more than 8 years for the legal process to produce a formal accounting for his death, the refiling of charges in December 2024 is the most recent chapter in a legal story that is still being written. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453, remains available to anyone who is concerned about a child's welfare or safety. Oregon's Child Protective Services, mental health crisis lines, and family support resources are part of the infrastructure that exists to address the conditions that precede these tragedies. No legal proceeding, however thorough, however ultimately accountable, is as valuable as the intervention that prevents a child from being placed in danger in the first place. This documentary has examined 10 cases drawn from Oregon's court records, 10 instances in which the legal system was asked to respond to the death or severe harm of a child at the hands of a parent or guardian. The cases span decades and counties. They involve different circumstances, different mental health contexts, different legal outcomes, and different relationships between the people involved. What they share is the fundamental reality that the children at their center, Eldon, Cheryl, Heather Snively's unborn child, Zachary, 2 unnamed young children in Gresham, London, Sophia, Nathaniel, Tracy Berry's final days with her daughter, and Caden, all deserved more. They deserved protection. They deserved futures. And the legal systems of Oregon, Illinois, and the courts of multiple counties have spent years attempting to deliver, through the mechanisms of criminal prosecution and sentencing, the accountability that those children were owed. The work of remembering, of documenting, and of understanding these cases is part of the larger work of building communities and systems that protect children more effectively. It is part of why this documentary exists, and why this channel continues to produce content of this kind. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary has informed you, moved you, or brought a case to your attention that you were not previously aware of, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when a new episode is published. Your support, every subscription, every like, every comment, is what makes Cold Case Hour possible.